Hey y'all, here's how to help support this show. First of all, buy my book. It's great. It's called Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan. Daniel Ellsberg and Ron Paul and Stephen M. Walt like it. Check it out at foolserrand.us. Also, sign up for the feeds, the podcast feeds at scotthorton.org. There's iTunes and Stitcher, and also the full interview archive now, 4,600 and something interviews are all on youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. So sign up, subscribe to that, and then check out scotthorton.org/donate for all the ways to donate there. $50 will get you a signed book. $100 will get you a QR code, silver commodity disc. $200 will get you a lifetime subscription to Listen and Think Libertarian audiobooks. A lifetime subscription to Listen and Think audio. And then, of course, you take all different kinds of Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash, and, of course, Zencoin, which sponsors this show. All that information there is at scotthorton.org/donate, as well as PayPal monthly subscriptions and patreon.com. If you donate at Patreon, then that's a good incentive to get more interviews out of me. I get paid per interview there, and anybody who signs up to donate $1 or more at patreon.com gets 2 free audiobooks. So find out about all that stuff at scotthorton.org/donate. And hey, leave me a good review on iTunes or Stitcher or Amazon.com if you've read the book, and share the shows and that kind of thing. All right, thanks.
War is the improvement of investment climates by other means. Clausewitz for dummies.
The Scott Horton Show.
Taking out Saddam Hussein turned out to be a pretty good deal.
They hate our freedoms.
We're dealing with Hitler revisited.
We couldn't wait for that Cold War to be over, could we? So we can go and play with our toys in the sand. Go and play with our toys in the sand.
No nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare.
Today, I authorize the Armed Forces of the United States to begin military action in Libya. That action has now begun.
When the president does it, that means that it is not illegal.
I cannot be silent in the face of the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government.
All right, you guys, introducing my good friend, our good friend, the heroic Sheldon Richman. He is the managing editor of the Libertarian Institute with me. Welcome back to the show. How the hell are you?
I'm doing great, Scott. Thanks for having me back. Always glad to be with you.
Yeah, man, it's been way too long since I had you on the show, and I'm glad we have a chance to talk about what we're talking about, too. It's one of your comparative advantages here, talking about trade and economics with us. So, President Trump has announced new tariffs, especially, I guess, just steel and aluminum, to put America first and build up America's economy, and you say that that's foolish or worse. Why is that?
It is worse than foolish. Well, Trump, to give Trump credit for a moment, and I'll put quotation marks around that word, this is actually a position that he seems to have been steadfast about for, 20 years or more. I mean, we usually think that Trump really has no ideas, no commitments. He just says whatever is going to advance him. He's a demagogue. But if you go back over his career, he seems to be pretty consistent against freedom to trade. We call it free trade, which is okay as a shorthand. But, it's not trade that's free. It's people trade. So he's been against freedom to trade for a very long time. So let me get the credit to him out of the way for being at least consistent, but he's consistently bad, not consistently good. The case against trade restrictions on people's trading activities, whether or not there are national boundaries involved, goes back, way before Adam Smith. I mean, we find this in other people, but Smith formalized it, and then in America, we have great works by Henry George and William Graham Sumner in the 19th century, and then the 20th century, with Friedman and Mises and various schools who generally believe in the free market, have been staunch free traders and have pointed out, like, over and over and over again, I mean, so many times, why free trade is good, why leaving people free to trade is good, and why restrictionism, and I don't like to call it protectionism, that seems to give it too much credit. Restrictions make us poorer. They may, in the short run, reward some cronies, some special interests, like Trump's policies this time will do. But they hurt everybody else. And so the cronies are always a very tiny minority of the workforce and the firms and industries in the country. So while it helps a very select few, and I do mean tiny, 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 especially in this age of robotics, where heavy plants have very few people in them because ottomation and the computers and robots do the work. It may help a tiny group of people, but it hurts all other companies that use those materials, steel and aluminum in this case, as inputs for their products, and a lot of those are exporters, so they're now at a disadvantage, and it harms consumers. So you put all those people who are hurt together, get that number, and put it up against the number of people who will be benefited in the short run, let's say, there's no contest. You're clearly sacrificing almost everybody to these few well-connected people, workers or firms or business owners and managers. It's a joke. It's a joke. This time they've invoked national security, but that has been done many times. Even the numbers don't hold it up. There's just no national security argument for this. But conservatives, unfortunately, seem to be falling for this. Fox News and our old friend Dan McCarthy, who's great on so many things, think this is a good idea, and there's just no case for it, period.
All right. So, first of all, on the national security thing, you brought that up just to dismiss it, and I just want to chime in real quick. I read a great piece by Stephen Chapman at the Chicago Tribune where he linked, I believe, even linked to the statistics, where he said when it comes to aluminum and steel, I don't remember exactly, but it was, I think, less than 5% in both cases come from China. And I think especially on steel, he said, America imports steel from like 10 different nations. And of course, if there was a war with China and America needed steel for its tank divisions or whatever it was, obviously all of our European allies and our Canadian allies and so forth would ramp up production to help us. It's, as you said, the numbers, they just don't bear out, even if hypothetically you took on the crisis.
I can elaborate on that.
Okay.
I think it's an article at the Mercatus Institute today or yesterday, which has some also has numbers. National defense and homeland security together used only about 3% of total steel shipments. That doesn't mean imports. That means all steel in the U.S. in 2015. 3%. As far as where we get foreign steel from, first of all, the U.S. makes the bulk of the steel that we use in this country, like 80 million metric tons. Another 30 comes from imports, but the top 7 providers are all close allies: Canada, the EU, Brazil, South Korea, Mexico, Turkey, and Japan. Together, according to Mercatus, they supplied 4/5 of the steel imported in 2016. And they would be reliable partners. And another economist, Scott Sumner, pointed out that the next world war will be a nuclear war, so we're not going to need steel. And smaller wars are going to not affect these allies. So even in the sort of worst case, there's not a national security.
Yeah, gotta admit, it's pretty hard to imagine a real shooting war with China that didn't end up turning to H-bombs. Especially with the Americans.
Yeah, and look, and you can easily go use the reductio ad absurdum for this, because what can't be claimed to be a matter of national security? If you're going to control steel and aluminum and what about other metals? What about other materials? What about ideas? Ideas and scientific ideas and technological ideas, you have to then oppose the free marketplace if you're in ideas, if you're concerned about national security, because who knows what ideas about weapons people will get just from scientific conferences. So should we make sure the scientists stay home, not let them go out of the country to engage? I mean, you could
stop giving them ideas, Sheldon Richman. I'm telling you.
Well, they probably already thought of it. I know it sounds ridiculous, and someone will say, "Oh, that's ridiculous." But once you open the gate to national security, every businessman can come to Washington, hat in hand, saying, "We're vital to national security." You know, Khrushchev once made a joke that maybe the most vital good for national security is buttons, because it helps hold the soldier's pants up. Imagine, how do you fight if you're trying to hold your pants up because you don't have you don't have the buttons.
Right.
So you can take this. It becomes ridiculous very fast, but it's not because of our side. It's because of their position is ridiculous. Yeah. And it's very sad to see. Well, you know, it's an old story. Conservatives, you put the word national security on or defense or military, and the conservatives, eat it up.
Yeah.
The great John T. Flynn pointed this out back in the 30s in his great book, As We Go Marching. He said, conservatives don't like big government or big government spending if it seems to be social welfare, but just slap the word defense on it, and they'll be right with you. They'll go for any amount of spending if you call it military. Same thing. Right.
But so here's the thing then. I happen to remember Ross Perot saying something to the effect of, listen, the reason that we have working classes in America who can afford to own their own homes and have a middle class kind of standard of living, even when they're doing, manual type jobs on assembly lines and this kind of thing, is because of protectionism in the first place. And that ultimately the world is a very poor place. And if it's just a race to the bottom, what you're going to hear is this giant sucking sound as all of America's good factory jobs go off to Mexico and go off to China. And so maybe you're arguing that, well, putting up a bunch of protection and tariffs is not going to bring those jobs back, or you're saying that even if it does, it's not worth it for people paying higher prices and so forth. But aren't they right that pulling the rug out from under all that previous protectionism has, really helped to accelerate, because it's not just... It's sort of the free market, but it's almost like in Russia, shock therapy, right? Where there's no soft landing. You take a bunch of factories that were protectioned into existence and towns up around them all across America. And this is now what we call the Rust Belt, where all these former factories, it used to be the Steel Belt. Now it's the Rust Belt because nothing's going on there anymore. And isn't that because of free trade in a way?
Well, it's not because of free trade. For one thing, what kills factory jobs is not primarily trade, but technology. And many economists have shown this to be the case. You just need very few people in factories anymore because they're all highly computerized and roboticized. So if you look at American industry, output is at an all-time high in the United States. And you can find the numbers. Mark Perry has written about this at AEI a lot. A lot of people pointed this out. Look at Don Boudreaux's Cafe Hayek. You can find the numbers. Manufacturing output and exports at an all-time high. Now, industrial jobs have been falling since the 70s, pre-WTO, pre-NAFTA, because of technology. So blaming trade, and when you blame trade, you're also going to be scapegoating other countries like China, is wrong, and it just sows resentment and hostility among countries. If we're concerned about national security, let's not sow resentment and hostility against other countries, because that's what leads to conflict and war.
Well, that's an important point. But what about, look, Mexicans just work cheaper than the amount of wages Americans would like to make. And so therefore, if you make Carrier air conditioners, you're just not going to hire people from Michigan anymore.
That's not what has harmed the steel industry. You started off talking about steel.
Okay, sure.
So let's keep it on steel.
All right.
Steel. There was a very good piece in Bloomberg yesterday. Googling it, I'm sure we'll find it. The steel industry has basically cut its own throat, and here's why. Look, after World War II, the U.S. was the only industrial power left standing. So, in effect, steel got a massive subsidy. Not only has it gotten a lot of money and trade protectionism over the years, but it had the benefit in World War II. Of course, it had all those government contracts in World War II and afterwards and before that. But it had an added benefit from the government. The government destroyed its competitors, right? Germany and Japan. And Europe was left in a shambles, so any other steel factories there were wrecked. So the U.S. was the only industry standing. And so that gave everybody the feeling that, oh, America is economically superior. We're dominant, and that's how God wants it, and that's the way it's going to be. Except the predictable thing happened. Without competition, the U.S. steel industry got lazy. They drifted. They coasted. And when Germany and Japan came back, and then other countries like South Korea came back, they adopted the newest technology that the American industry was very slow to adopt. In the 1970s and 80s, when U.S. Steel and the others were either closing or winding to Washington, a smaller company called Nucor Steel, which is known as a mini mill and fills like niche demand for specialty steel, was booming and opposed aid from the government. So this is bogus. This is not the Mexicans. This is not cheap, unskilled labor. Steel is a high-skilled area right now. You got to know computers and programming and stuff like that. The day of the old mill where thousands of people worked is ridiculous. There's a mill around Pittsburgh now I read about that once had 1,400 workers and today has like 14 workers. But it's not because it's turning out less steel. It's because we don't need people to do that anymore. We need people to do other things. Mm-hmm. And that's what trade does. It guides people into different areas.
Well, now, but Mexico would have been a bad example on steel. China's the example on steel that they use, right? And then, but the same argument is that Chinese labor is cheaper. They don't even need these expensive machines because Chinese laborers are a dime a dozen or something like that.
They're not going to be able to compete worldwide with high-tech steel firms. The fact that they have a slew of unskilled workers, that's not how it works. They're not going to make quality steel products like that. And then we only import a very tiny percentage from China. So it's got nothing to do with China. This is typical Trump. He likes to say China. You notice how he emphasizes it. He's just he tries to scare the American people with these bogeymen. Maybe he believes it. Maybe he's sincere. I don't know if that would be worse, or I don't know if it would be worse that he actually believes it or he's just a liar. It's bogus. We're not threatened by unskilled Chinese workers. I mean, that's just ridiculous. Or Mexican workers.
Yeah. It's funny. I was listening to that Circle Jerk song, Brave New World, where he's talking about life on a factory line. And is this really what we're made for and all that? And it's funny because that song was recorded at the end of that era when, having a middle class or working class sort of drone existence on an assembly line in America was becoming really a thing of the past. But so here's the problem though, right? Is they'll teach you in college, well, you've got structural unemployment, and that is that, as the economy changes, some people are going to be out of work. But so what that translates into in human terms is a bunch of people out of work, and they don't know what to do, and maybe they can't, with the level of education that they have, get a job that pays as well as they would have been getting paid if they could work on an assembly line like back in the day. So you're saying it's not really the Chinese, it's the robots. But so I'm changing the subject then, I guess. People are feeling this economic anxiety, man. This is how Trump got elected, right? It wasn't race. It was that people feel like the centrist establishment consensus is not concerned with our well-being because look at us, we're screwed.
Well, look, but it wasn't just one thing. Yeah, economic anxiety in some places.
Well, that was your margin right there,
culture,
right?
Culture and other things. Yeah, but that's the result of ignorance and the fact that politicians have an interest in telling people that and sowing the seeds long before Trump. Of sowing the seeds of anxiety. That's how you get elected. You say, look, elect me because look what these other politicians have been doing. They've created all these problems. So there's that. And look, the world is always uncertain. This is not the result of government. That in itself is not the result of government policy. It's just in the nature of things. There is always change. Changing consumer tastes throws tons of people out of work every year. So should we tell people they can't stop buying what they've been buying all along because that's not fair to the people who make those things? technology, as I already said, throws many more people out of work than trade does. Should we now control technological innovation? Should we have bureaucrats and their economic experts controlling the flow of innovation so as not to be too disruptive? Who has confidence they would know what the hell they're doing? There was a time when 80% or more of Americans worked on farms because the machinery and the new seeds and fertilizer and all that stuff required that much labor. Should we have stopped that? Yeah, those people lost jobs. Lots of them found new jobs. Now, I'm not saying there's not personal hardship, but that's life. Now, government can minimize the hardship by doing lots of things, sweeping away all the regulations that make it harder for people to get retrained and move into different areas. Get rid of occupational licensing, get rid of land use controls that make it difficult for people to move from place to place, to look for the best opportunities. But to try to keep change from happening or to control change to make it a manageable flow, do you realize the totalitarian state you'd need to have to try to accomplish that? And of course, it wouldn't do any good anyway. You just put a bunch of power mongers in charge of things. And, as Hayek points out in The Road to Serfdom, the worse get on top in a regime like that. So, people need to think about what they're asking for. They really want the state, they want politicians to manage change in order to keep anybody from ever suffering any economic hardship. It's ridiculous. We need to teach people. This is the problem. People don't understand the economic way of thinking. They don't realize that if you protect one group of workers, you hurt everybody else, including exporters. When the exports fall, is Trump going to say, hey, that's because countries aren't letting in our goods? Or is he going to say, well, I guess I made a mistake with my tariffs because American firms now have to pay more for inputs, which means their product on the export market is more expensive than their competitors who are able to buy the cheaper inputs because they don't have tariffs on their stuff.
I read it was in that Steve Chapman piece in the Chicago Tribune where he quotes a European Union economic minister saying, well, that's all right. We'll just have to put a bunch of tariffs on American motorcycles and this and that. I forgot the other things he mentioned. And he said, yes, this is completely stupid, but we can do stupid. That was the quoat.
Well,
economic minister, we can play this trade war all the way into a black hole with you.
Well, and he's at least he kind of realizes it's stupid, but why is he doing it? Look, if you see, as somebody just put it, it's been put this way 100 times that I happened to see it this morning. If you see somebody shoot himself in the foot, you don't say, okay, because you did that, I'm going to shoot myself in the foot.
Right.
Just because another country is hurting its consumers and also a lot of its domestic producers, doesn't mean we should retaliate by hurting our consumers and our domestic producers. The great Henry George said, and it's at the top of my article today at the Libertarian Institute, protectionism teaches you that you should do to yourself in time of peace what the enemy tries to do in time of war, right? When you're at war in the old days, they bombed your ports or blockaded your ports so goods couldn't get in. In time of peace, we blockade our own ports so that goods can't come in. This is insanity.
Right. All right, now, so, all right, so talk about trade deficits. You say trade deficits are not bad. This is one that, I love Pat Buchanan. He's such a great anti-war guy, and he's such a nice guy. I can't help it, even though he's such a right-winger. And boy, when it comes to trade deficits, he just says, man, oh man, was it a bad deal for America to open up trade relations with China this way, most favored nation trading status. And look at our terrible trade deficits. So what's the problem or what isn't?
Look, Pat, I like Pat. I've known Pat personally. I haven't seen him for a while because I don't live in the D.C. area anymore, but very nice guy. He's always been very nice to me. And he's good on a lot of stuff. He doesn't like war. Good for him. Doesn't like the empire. But he's totally wrong on trade because on trade, which means at a deeper level, he is a collectivist. His brand of collectivism is nationalism. He thinks it's nations that trade. Nations don't trade. Individuals trade. Nations don't trade. The moment you start thinking in terms of these abstract entities, you're going to get into trouble. So who cares, and this is how I put it in the article, who cares that if the individuals who comprise Group A, or call it Country A if you like to, in the aggregate buy more from the individuals in Group B than the individuals in Group B buy from Group A? Who cares? I have infinite trade deficit with Kroger, my local supermarket. I buy from them every week, sometimes more than once a week. They buy nothing from me. They've never paid me to edit an article or write an article, which are my products, right? My services. So I have a trade deficit with Kroger. I have a trade deficit with everybody I buy from because I don't sell anything to them. It doesn't matter. Trump says we're losing money from our trade deficit. That's bull. I trade money when I trade money at the grocery store and get cold cuts and all the stuff I buy. I've given money, but I didn't lose money because I wanted the stuff more than the money or anything else I could have bought with the money. I mean, that's what trade is about. Trade is positive sum. He thinks it's negative sum. And at the moment of the trade, both parties expect the benefit or else they wouldn't have traded. Now, later they might decide they made a mistake, but that's not part of the story. We live in a world of uncertainty. I may decide, oh, darn it, I wish I hadn't bought that. The point is, at the time, I expect the benefit and the other person, and we can both benefit. In other words, it's positive sum. So the deficit's an accounting fiction. When they say trade deficit, they mean the merchandise deficit. So we're talking about merchandise, right? Goods that are bought worldwide. But that's only part of the accounting.
Well, the other side isn't the point though that it's like an indication though, the way they're saying it. I don't know which number would be the correct indicator, but they're saying when the number is this high, it means that it basically shows that we're producing so much less than them that it's undermining our ability to make money as producers. It gives us cheap goods to buy, but maybe we won't be able to afford them if we don't have good jobs producing things too.
Well, no one will sell here if we have no money to buy things. So I guess that problem will take care of itself. No, it's not. Look, world trade in all things has to balance. It's an accounting fact. If you count everything, it's balanced. There's a corresponding account to the merchandise account. If the merchandise account, that's the goods that are traded, exports and imports, if that's in deficit, there's a corresponding surplus on the other page. What's the surplus in? It's the capital account. In other words, let's say you're Japanese and you're an exporter. Now, you're getting dollars when you bring your goods here because we pay in dollars, but you don't really want dollars. You can't spend dollars in your grocery store. So that gives you a couple of choices of things to do with your dollars. You can either buy American goods, that would be Americans exporting, but you have another alternative. You could invest that money in the United States. You can buy stock. You could buy bonds. You could buy real estate, that's the opposite, the other side of the coin of the deficit. We have a capital surplus. In other words, an inflow of investment. And here's the funny thing. Trump seems to know that, but he doesn't connect it. He and Wilbur Ross. They say the tariffs are good because it will force foreign manufacturers to come here and open facilities. But if they open facilities here, they're not buying American goods. So in other words, they're going to be increasing the trade deficit while they're also increasing the capital surplus. Mm-hmm. You see, you can't both buy American goods and use those dollars to invest in the United States.
Well, okay, but and look, I'm playing devil's advocate, and plus I'm pretty ignorant of all this stuff, so I'm oversimplifying. But isn't their argument that yes, we're taking water from the deep end of the pool and we're pouring it into the shallow end of the pool, but that's where the Americans are. So screw the Chinese. Like, yeah, it all has to balance, but we want the Americans to be, on the winning end of the ledger. Because that's who we are. That's where we live.
That's not responsive to what I said. People complain about the trade deficit. Trump complains about the trade deficit. It doesn't mean we're not losing money. When we send money to a seller, we're not losing money.
Yeah, but but who's the we? I guess if you look at it in terms of the people who work on the assembly line, that's a better blue collar job than having two different waitress jobs or what have you that, right?
But I've already addressed that in the previous section of this conversation. Because if you try to stop that trade, you hurt other manufacturers. Look. The industry that makes airplanes and automobiles and spare parts for those things buy steel, buy aluminum, and buy other materials to make those products. Those are components to their finished products, which they often export. So if you make steel more expensive, which is the whole point of having tariffs, to make it more expensive, you've hurt them. So all you've done, and I addressed this at the final section of my piece, the kind of people that you're now trying to characterize by giving their arguments, they're advocates of privilege, whether they know it or not. They're saying the few steel workers ought to have privileges that the vast majority of other manufacturing workers should not have. So you can't say trade will hurt these guys on the line. What about other industries that have lines, to the extent they still have assembly lines that have people? What about the other ones, the downstream, the ones that use steel and aluminum? So you haven't, they haven't made a case that this is good for America. They've made a case that it's good for a very tiny number of workers at the expense of all other workers, including blue collar, factory workers, to the extent we still have those things.
All right, here's who supports this show. Zencash. It's a great new cryptocurrency, digital currency, if you prefer. I think I do. Zensystem.io to read all about it. It's not just a currency, but it's also a very secure messaging app and document transfer application and this kind of thing. Zensystem.io to find out all about Zencash. And then also read the book, The War State, by the great Mike Swanson, a great early history of the rise of the military-industrial complex and the new right after World War II. And get Mike Swanson's great investment advice at wallstreetwindow.com. And when you follow his advice, you'll want to get your precious metals from Roberts & Roberts Brokerage Inc. That's RBI.co. You have to have at least 10 or 20% of your savings in metals, of course. And if you buy with Bitcoin, they charge no premium at all. At Roberts & Roberts Brokerage Inc. RBI.co. Get your anti-government propaganda from libertystickers.com. Brand new website and a lot of great new art coming very soon at libertystickers.com. And hey, listen, it's 2018. You're still stuck with a 2010 model website. For your band, your business, your whatever it is that you're doing out there, you need a new site. Go to expanddesigns.com/Scott and you'll save $500. Well, it seems like that might even be bad politics then, if they actually, if there's a special interest in the owners of a few different steel mills at the expense of the owners of so many other factories. Forget labor. What about the other Republicans here?
Look, it's Bastiat's what is seen and what is not seen. If a steel plant closes, the local and even the national networks will rush there, right, and show the gate with the lock and the chain on it, and the workers leaving, saying, look at this, trade or whatever they want to blame has closed this steel company. Do they ever run to the thriving, auto parts manufacturer or airplane parts or airplane plant and say, oh, but these plants are thriving because they're able to buy inexpensive steel from Canada, Brazil, Mexico, South Korea, and China? No, they don't do that. They point out the bad news. Oh, look at these people. They lost their job. The plant is closed. They don't go to find the benefits from trade because they're very diffused. They're not real obvious. There's not a big sign, we're thriving because of trade. But if the plant closes, somebody's going to be saying we're closing because of trade. It's a totally skewed, distorted way to look at things. And most reporters and news editors are ignorant of economics, so they don't even know. They never even think that maybe we ought to go find a thriving company that's doing benefits from trade. You know how much how exports were stimulated by NAFTA, and I'm not an unabashed fan of NAFTA. There's plenty of state intervention authorized by NAFTA, but to the extent that it put tariffs down to zero in North America, and also the WTO, which did that, in over a much wider area globally, exports have skyrocketed. And most of what America imports are producers' goods. In other words, machines and stuff that go into products which then get exported. You ever see that reported? Never.
No,
it's never pointed out. It's just.
I mean, it even sounds like you're burying the lead. That should have been your very first point. But yeah,
that's been said a lot of times. I know it's always frustrating to write about trade because there's like a zillion leads and you never know what to put first.
Yeah, no, that wasn't a real criticism, but I'm just saying, yeah, it's such a huge point to understand.
You got to read Bastiat. My 2 words are read Bastiat.
All right, so now the world's greatest number 1 hero, Ron Paul, always opposed NAFTA and GATT because he said we ought to have real free trade. We ought to repeal all the restrictions on trade. We just have a new bill that says all those old restrictions are hereby repealed, and then we're good. And I don't really want to create a new World Trade Organization with this GATT thing, and I don't want to do this even NAFTA with Mexico and Canada because it amounts to creating new government bureaucracies. So I guess my question is that really a problem? Or I mean, they regulate in favor of freer trade so much that it's okay with you, or you really are Ron Paulian on that?
It's going to sound like a cop-out, but look, it's complicated. I wish things were more simple. Another objection Ron Paul made to NAFTA and WTO is it sacrifices our sovereignty, and I don't like when people say things like that. I don't care about sovereignty. So, look, I agree with him. The ideal is world free trade. The second best thing is unilateral free trade by the United States. Just say, we don't care what other countries do. At midnight tonight, all trade restrictions, or 5 minutes from now, all trade restrictions are abolished. Americans are free to do what they want. I wish that could happen. It's not going to happen. The third best thing then are these agreements, and they always put in stuff that I'm going to object to. Absolutely. Labor conditions, environmental stuff, which then restrict trade on the grounds that it's bad for labor. I mean, it's never pure, of course not. But there is one sort of public choice argument for these agreements. Let me say one other thing before I say that. If those agreements had been defeated, and I was involved in those fights, I was working in Washington, at Cato, and other places in the days of NAFTA and the WTO, and the libertarians were divided. Some were for those things and some were against. If those things had gone down, had lost, do you think people would have said, oh, this is a victory for free trade, now we move on to unilateral free trade? No. It would have been seen as a victory for the protectionists, and it would have emboldened Pat Buchanan and Perot and the other protectionists. Mm-hmm. So, you got to be careful what you ask for. It wouldn't have been seen as a victory for free trade. They wouldn't have ushered in free trade at that point. But here's one thing that the agreements do, and this is kind of a public choice argument. If you can get a generally free trade agreement that puts tariffs down to zero, don't forget, in those agreements, our tariffs are already pretty low. Our tariffs have been falling since World War II and GATT and those various agreements that preceded the WTO. Ours were pretty low. Other countries had higher tariffs. So what those agreements tended to do, and I don't know what, Trump can't admit this because it goes against this whole narrative, it in effect benefited the American economy, if we want to talk in those terms, more than it affected the foreign, because they already had almost open access to our market. It was American exporters that faced higher tariffs and other restrictions in Mexico and other places. So it lowered those to zero or near zero. There are exceptions, but so I don't quite understand what the Trump's objection is. But here's what an agreement can do that works to the benefit of free trade. If the government signs one of these agreements, like NAFTA, then when the president or Congress gets pressure from a domestic producer saying, I need relief from imports, give me relief from imports, help. Instead of saying, no, I can't, I'm not doing it, and then getting constituencies mad, and then they might lose at the next election, they can say, hey, look, my hands are tied. We've signed this agreement which opens their market, but also opens our market, so there's nothing I can do. It protects the politician who likes free trade but needs to be able to say no to people. It's much easier to say, hey, we have this world agreement. What can I do about it? I'm sorry. Now, that's all. That's like political expediency. I agree, but I want to get to free trade. We open our markets not as a favor to other countries. We open our markets because we want goods and services. That's what the Wealth of Nations was all about. Look what Adam Smith meant by that title. He was saying the Wealth of Nations is not your gold stock, your gold hoard, or in other words, your cash. It's access to goods. That's what makes for wealth. So that he was rebutting the protectionists and the mercantilists by pointing out what wealth actually consists of. It's access to goods. It's having goods and services at your disposal at low prices. And so we shouldn't think of ourselves as opening our markets as a concession in order to get them to open their markets. We open our markets because we want the goods, darn it.
Right. Okay, but now, so what about the leftist argument that, the empire is just part of capitalism and that capitalism has to keep expanding? And of course, as long as there's a Marine Corps, they'll hire the Smedley Butlers of the world to kick open those doors when the rest of the countries of the world probably would prefer to not have free trade and would prefer to have their own protectionism, whether that's because they're smart or they're dumb, according to you, in terms of how they make those value judgments. But that basically the free trade zone of the world is formerly known as the British Empire. Now it's the American one. And that without American military force, we wouldn't have the globalization of trade. It takes the globalization of government to create this situation of quote unquote free trade.
Well, it seems to me you can easily divide free trade, the principle of free trade, from the principle of empire. It's not, one doesn't entail the other. We can have free trade. Look, I think it's wrong to say there's only global trade because there's a U.S. empire. People have increasingly realized there are gains from trade, even if the people live on the other side of a national border. So people would be drawn toward trade with or without the U.S. empire. We don't need the U.S. empire to have global trade. But if other governments don't want to open up their markets and let their people be free, our government should not be forcing that. I mean, I don't want to even have a government, but assuming we have one, that's their business. It's unfortunate they're hurting their own people, but that shouldn't stop us from having our markets wide open. Like I said, unilateral, unconditional free trade is a good thing. Even if no one else is practicing free trade, we should. Of course, we'll be setting an example, and other people will want to emulate it when we see how wealthy we are. But it doesn't have the fact that some imperialists have talked free trade doesn't mean free trade is an imperialist policy. You can be a free trader and an anti-imperialist. Richard Cobden and John Bright, the great free traders and anti-imperialists of 19th century Britain, show that. Frederick Bastiat was another one. William Graham Sumner was a great free trader and part of the Anti-Imperialist League. There's no logical connection between those two things.
Well, I mean, I guess the thing is, if capitalism, as you've pointed out oftentimes, that phrase was actually coined by Marx to describe a system of state power. It never meant really just free markets in the freest way, and that's why you don't use the big C word all the time there. But so, the leftist argument is, hey, as long as there's a state, obviously businessmen are going to create a military-industrial complex and a world empire out of it if they can.
Well, first of all, Marx wasn't actually the first to use that. Capitalist was used disparagingly by the radical libertarians of early 19th century England, like Thomas Hodgkin. So it even predates Marx. Marx read those people, so maybe he got it from that.
And you're saying this was also a guy who was criticizing the system of state favors for businessmen rather than the idea of property and businessmen.
Right. He was against privileges to capital, to owners of capital. Exactly right. So I'm trying to think what your point was after that. I got fixed on your Marx point.
Well, just that, every businessman will get on the dole if he can. And if that means, and in practice, according to a leftist perspective, and I think maybe just a realist one, that as long as there's a state and it's not anarcho-capitalism, it's just capitalism, then it's going to be mercantilism and empire, because as long as there's a government to bribe, they will bribe it.
So their solution is to make the state even bigger and give it comprehensive control over the economy. I don't quite see how that's a solution to their complaint.
Right. They do kind of have a point, though, about the right being, a bunch of socialists, too, in other words.
When it comes to things like this, when it comes to military matters, they're socialists. That's right. The military, of course, is a huge state socialist institution, and you can see how it spreads the trade, because they'll buy any trade restriction if you tell them it's for national security, which then can end up including everything. So in principle, they're totalitarian socialists as well. And they're nationalists. They're collectivist nationalists. They have this nationalist religion, which they're willing to sacrifice a great deal to. And I don't quite understand how they can also claim to be for individual liberty and free market. They sometimes use the word free markets and limited government, because they're clearly not.
Yeah. Well, and so, see, my thing is I have a lot of sympathy for this leftist argument, basically, that capitalism with a police force is fascism. And so, but then the question is, so what are you going to get rid of? Property rights and free exchange, or get rid of the cops? And then to me, the answer is pretty simple. It's the government that's the problem. It's not the profit motive itself. I mean, what are you going to do? All lay down and starve to death?
Well, look, we need to make conceptual distinctions here. So the fact, like I said, the fact that an imperialist might have talked free trade, although they didn't always talk free trade. I mean, Smith was opposed to the British Empire because it was mercantilist, because it protected English merchants and English industrialists. He was against all that. I mean, his book is a good part of his book is a brief against trade restrictions and the empire. So imperialists don't count on imperialists to be free traders. But even if you can find one that says we need an empire because we need to open up those foreign markets, that's not free trade. Compton's got a great quote about how if you apply violence to trade, you change its very nature, and he compared it to applying violence to religion. In other words, if you force religion on people, you're changing its very nature. Same thing. If you apply violence to trade, you've changed its nature. So he was a free trader, but he did not want the British fleet opening markets with guns.
Yeah. All right, so now back to the original point. How bad is this going to be? This is a huge new distortion and disruption in pricing in the market. So what's going to happen?
Well, it's going to harm, like I said, the downstream producers who need steel and aluminum.
But like to a great degree and quickly, it's going to be a disruption really bad, or what? What do you think?
Well, it could throw marginal firms out of business, the ones that are already sort of at the edge. If you increase the prices of key inputs, there's probably a lot less steel and aluminum being used these days than, say, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, just because of new materials. So, I don't know exactly. I'm not an econometrician, assuming that those guys can even figure things out. But there are going to be marginal firms that the higher price for those inputs now might make the difference between them being viable and not being viable. That's always the danger. So if they close, then jobs are lost. What about the hardship to those people? Well, we don't give a damn about those people. Consumers will pay more for products. The whole point is to raise prices. That's why you put a tariff on. It's not just that you're tax. They present it as we're taxing and penalizing those foreign countries. No, you're penalizing the buyers of their goods, including the American buyers of those goods, and any goods that those things go into and make new goods, different goods further down, all the way down to the consumer level. So yes, it will be disruptive. The changes will have to be made. Maybe some of those companies will switch from steel and aluminum to some other substitute, plastic or whatever modern materials that have come along that can function as substitutes. If the pricing differences are right, they may shift, which means you haven't helped the steel workers or the aluminum workers if companies are shifting out of aluminum and steel and buying substitutes. Who have you helped? Well, you can say you helped the sellers of the substitutes. But it's a distortion. See, the key thing is, again, I put this in the article, you have to understand what the price system is. And, it sounds like a dull, dry subject. Nobody cares about it. The price system is this massive guide to entrepreneurs and producers about what to produce and how. The changes in relative prices give clues. They're not perfect, but nothing's perfect. they give clues to what's in demand, what's not so much in demand, what's plentiful in terms of resources and labor services, and what's not so plentiful, all comparative, of course. And then it guides, it's like, it's like beacons in the sky, like lighthouses, for entrepreneurs to say, okay, I think we need to shift out of producing this, X, and shift into producing Y, because the return looks like it's going to be better there, and the return means there's a demand, a greater demand for it than for X, where the demand and return was lower. And all that's constantly changing. It's a very sensitive guidance system. The government's going to come in and distort the signals, which means that it's not a good guide anymore. And you're going to get all kinds of things out of whack. It's just like his talk about NAFTA. Oh, we're going to cancel NAFTA if we don't like how they renegotiate. That is going to be so disruptive. He has no conception of the intricate web of suppliers and vendors and buyers of different materials and all this stuff that go into throughout this North America economy. And I say North American here in this case because we're talking about NAFTA. If he were to cancel that tomorrow, it could be chaos because suddenly all these arrangements will be thrown, into uncertainty. The prices will change. Things we won't be able to get things we need. He's risking a great deal of dislocation, and that means flesh and blood hardship. It's not just abstract. It's people being out of jobs and facing higher prices. And yet he claims America first. He wants to protect American workers. It's complete nonsense. And again, I don't know if he's stupid or if he's a demagogue. And I don't know which would be worse. I guess he could be both. Yes. But if he's a demagogue, he's saying to himself, look, I know this is all bull, but I'm going to tell people this anyway because this is what my base wants to hear. On the other hand, if he's stupid, he's saying, hey, I really do believe this, so I'm going to say it. So I don't know which the case is, and I don't know which would be worse.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, these don't have to be exclusive concepts. He can think it's a good idea and a great one to flog to, whatever extent. Now, so let's go ahead and be alarmist and crazy then here. You mentioned Bastiat says when goods don't cross borders, soldiers will. And that reminds me of, and I guess this would have been, I don't know when Bastiat died, but after his time.
1851.
Oh, okay, yeah, there you go. So, a little while later anyway. But Jim Powell's great book, Wilson's War, about how everything in the whole world is Woodrow Wilson's fault. He says that, a big part of what happened with the outbreak of World War I was it was basically two competing free trade zones ended up coalescing into the Allies and Central Powers in that war. And that they were, already sort of de facto alliances in a commercial sense, and working against each other in kind of in a competitive, mercantilist sort of collectivist way, and that this ended up helping lead to the war itself. I'm almost positive that was Powell's book. I'm 99% sure that it was, where he talks all about that. So I wonder if, first of all, you agree with that, because I know you know everything about everything, and then I wonder whether you could translate that to current day. Do you think that this would end up leading to some kind of real conflict, or that it's more likely to than not, or some kind of thing?
Well, look, I'm not up on my World War I revisionism. It's not something I've been focusing on lately. I don't think we can say World War I was the result of free trade. If you look at, this would be more about World War II.
If I'm saying it right, I think it was competition between two competing free trade zones that did not have free trade with each other. That it was more, but it was the beginning of these sort of supranational markets in these two separate and competing alliances.
The fact that you can have trading blocks that are relatively or pretty free inside doesn't really solve the whole problem, or doesn't deliver all the benefits of free trade. Because if the blocks are protectionist toward each other, like the EU is not open. The EU maybe has free trade within it, but it doesn't have free trade with the rest of the world. The U.S. Either has or is negotiating a trade agreement with the EU. Why do we need to negotiate? Why don't we just have trade? What do we need an agreement for? So, that would still be a protectionism. Look, it just as a matter of stands to reason. It's just a matter of common sense that when people are trading, that puts any hostility and resentment sort of on the back burner, and can end up fading away, because when people trade, they're looking for ways to cooperate. Trade is cooperation. It's the ultimate in social cooperation. I don't know why the left isn't more interested in trade, especially worldwide trade. It's social cooperation. Mises pointed out how between the wars, protectionism is what really helped deliver the Second World War. In his book, Omnipotent Government, you have Germany trying to achieve autarky, which means sort of self-sufficiency, which is kind of an idea Trump seems to like. But that means when there are resources beyond your borders that you need, you don't want to trade, so you're thinking about conquest because you need the stuff, right? Germany couldn't produce everything it needed, so it needed to get stuff. And it didn't want to have peaceful trade relations, so it had conquest on its mind. So protectionism yields hostility, resentment, tensions, and conflict. And trade, I'm not saying it's perfect. Nothing's perfect, and politicians can always screw things up. Even if you have free trade, politicians might still find a reason to get into war, might get insulted. Like Trump might get insulted that somebody snubbed him, and maybe we'll go to war. The point is, though, it seems to me you reduce the chances of war if people are trading with each other. Because why do you want to bomb the market where you send your goods?
Yeah. Well, a good example of that, right, was in the very early months of the first Bush Jr. administration when the Chinese forced down this spy plane, and basically Colin Powell, acting on behalf of Wall Street, said, we are not escalating this. We are going to make nice, and even if we have to lose a little bit of face, we are going to work this out, because you got, I don't know, however many hundreds and hundreds of different billionaires and hundreds of millionaires up there in New York saying, yeah, we like getting along with China on a day-to-day and a month-to-month basis, and you idiot Republicans aren't going to screw that up for us. And at the end of the day, thank God, what they say goes, at least on that issue.
Yeah. Well, when people were saying, the reason Trump wants friendly relations with Russia is because he's got these business dealings. He's got money on the line. My answer to that was good. That makes our point. If people are doing business with each other, they don't want to go to war. So, if anything, it proves the free trade point. If Trump is only wants to be friendly with Putin because he's got some business interests involved, that makes my point. Good for him.
Right. Yeah. Good for us. All right. Hey, we should leave it at that. We're way over time anyway, but I just love talking with you. Thanks for doing the show again, Sheldon.
Anytime, Scott. Talk to you soon.
All right, you guys. That's the great Sheldon Richman. He's my partner over there at the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org. And this article, he does one every Friday, TGIF. The goal is freedom. Every Friday. And this one is called Trading Places. And, or actually, Trading Places. It's probably the better way to enunciate that. At the Libertarian Institute. And so I'm Scott Horton, libertarianinstitute.org, scotthorton.org, youtube.com, foolserrand.us for my book, Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and antiwar.com for a bunch of great, horrible stuff to read. And follow me on Twitter at Scott Horton Show. Thanks, you guys.